connecting. So, hi everyone, and welcome to this workshop on paradoxical leadership. I just want to make sure that you're all seeing the screen. So you're all seeing the screen saying paradoxical leadership. I'm seeing Frederica, thank you, saying nodding. Good.
Yes.
And we've got about 45 minutes of things to discuss. And I really like the idea of being a bit interactive. So you've got questions, ask, but we're going to go through quite a lot of material, and then we'll have a Q&A towards the end. So the agenda is really that, we need a new leadership model for an increasing complex and uncertain world. Everyone knows about the volatility that we have, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, why we need a new leadership model. We're going to talk a little bit about the science.
Ask a quick question.
Yeah.
Will we be able to get a copy of the slides at the end to save me frantically scribbling notes? Is that right?
Yeah, I like that as well. So that you don't worry about taking notes and notes. Exactly. We're happy to share the slides. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. I'll listen and concentrate then.
That's great. That's fine. That's nice as well, isn't it? You don't have to worry about taking all the notes. The science behind managing paradoxical thinking, strategies for balancing the competing demands of paradoxical leadership, and tips for leaders to adapt and succeed in a rapidly changing business context. So excuse me. So let's start with a bit of a story. So once upon a time, 70,000 years ago, more or less, give a couple of 10,000 years or so, we're like a little band of people. Let's say it's us. We're a little band of people, and we find ourselves next to a nice cave and go like, that's nice. And there's some food nearby, so we can do some gathering. We'll do some hunting, but we'll also do some gathering nice there. Build a little fire, get ourselves nice and cozy. But what happens if we stay here and don't actually do anything else? Don't do anything, but just eat the food that's there. And we exploit our local resources. What might happen? You can put the answers in the chat if you want.
We will be run out of resources.
Run out of resources, right? If we exploit our resources too much, we'll run out of them. So what do we need to do in order to avoid that?
Go find some more resources.
Go find more stuff, right? Find more resources. So we send out a few of you to go out there and explore in the world. It's dangerous. We know it's extremely dangerous. There's a lot of hazards out there. And eventually you find some extra resources. You go, great. So now we got this extra supply. And then something interesting also happens. So on your travels, you come back and report that you found a big river. And also that there's some even more stuff on the other side. There's some nice blue fruit over on the other side. And what do you need to do then? What's the next level of, we got some exploiting of our local resources. We got some exploring of the further and more distant stuff. But if we want to do even more exploring, what needs to happen next to be able to cross the river?
We need to be creative.
Yeah, for example.
I would start building a bridge if you can.
Right, so we need some new technology, new ways of doing things, new things to think about, and it could be either bridge building or learning a new skill like swimming, or learning, again, new technology, making a boat or a raft to get across the river. And they're also the leaps that we have to make if we want to be able to get the most of surviving in this complex world that we live in. So now let's look at this in a business context. And I'd like to introduce our first 2x2. Ali and I love a good 2x2. So whenever there's one there, we'll always look to see that we can exploit it. And this was a lovely graph that I discovered when I was first doing my brain science, neuroscience studies to become a practitioner in brain and behavior change. So you got exploit on the y-axis and explore on the x-axis. So what happens if we exploit, like we said before, lots of exploitation, but little exploring? In a business context, what might happen?
Well, again,
and we've seen this with big brands on the high street, right? So say more.
Running out of options.
Running out of options. And that's the interesting thing. In a very busy and complex world, running out of options is not a good idea, right? It's unsustainable. And we've seen many big brands. I always think it's really sad and in a way hilarious that the people who invented the digital camera, Kodak, said, oh no, that's going to erode our film stuff. So we're not going to get into digital cameras. they no longer exist. And then what happens, however, if we are constantly exploring, but don't exploit any of those things that we explore?
Then we don't profit from it.
Exactly, right? We don't profit. So it's not really commercially viable. We become commercially unviable. We're just running around trying new things, but not actually settling on something that is a good product to sell or a service to offer the market really wants. So what we need is integrated sustainable growth by exploiting what we have plus exploring. And this is one of the classic paradoxes that's been with us ever since we were running around in the early days, 70,000 years ago. And if you do neither, you're not going to last very long. You're going to stagnate and probably disappear. So this is a bit of the essence of what we want to talk about. But our brains are our brains. In fact, our brains haven't changed much in the last 20, 30,000 years. So what we have is still the instrument that we had back then. And now we're able to see into brains for the first time ever, really, in the last 20 years or so. So the neuroscientists are actually discovering what's going on inside our brains rather than just chopping up the brains of dead people, which doesn't tell you much about how thinking actually happens. And one of the things I'd like to introduce just a couple of parts of the brain to you. And one of them is the prefrontal cortex, which is all about understanding, memorizing, recalling, decision-making, and one that's often forgotten about, inhibiting. And then there's two other parts of the brain that really drive our behavior. And one of them is the reward system, which is driven by a chemical called dopamine. It energizes and makes us curious because we anticipate a reward. So if we're going to go off exploring, we'll only be motivated to explore if we anticipate a reward. If we anticipate death and destruction, we're not going to go exploring. Because actually, the other part of our brain, the amygdala, is all the memories of all the threats we've ever had in our life, activates adrenaline, which gives us a fight or flight response. So that can inhibit exploring, and it can inhibit a lot of things, actually. So I'd just like to mention what actually happens if we get the balance of these things wrong. So according to the Neuro Leadership Institute, David Rock and co., they're a great bunch of people to watch out for. David Rock's written some fantastic books. They are saying that it's now known that the threat response, bad things happening, is 5 times stronger than the reward response, good things happening. And that's simply a survival thing. So ever since we were running around in the Stone Age, before that, prehistoric, the ones who survived, i.e. everyone sitting on this call, who is a survivor of all those years of pandemics, your genes survived, of all the plagues and catastrophes that have befallen humans over the years. We're the survivors, but we've got the brain that's left with this very sensitive alertness to things going wrong, to threats. So what actually happens, just briefly in the chat, what happens when we get what we call an amygdala hijack, where our brain begins to fry a little bit and we go like, ah, there's a threat. What actually happens to our thinking and our behavior? Just in the chat.
Or behavior would come stress, or in the chat. Okay.
Oh, you can say it as well. Yep, you can say it. Anything? I'm not seeing the chat, Ali, so if you could let me know.
Yep. So James is on with freeze. It's very short term, uncontrolled, muddled, stressed behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. We tend to get very narrow focus in our mind. We make accidental connections in our brains, and it all goes a little bit haywire. And that's not a good place for a leader to be, right? So in fact, Ali and I are currently reading a very interesting book called Deliberate Calm, which is all about the absolute critical importance of being able to manage your brain. So with all of this stuff happening on a regular basis and this sort of underlying stress that's out there in the business world, it's really important to be able to manage your brain effectively. And calming our brain, one of the key things that we wanted to introduce you to today is how to calm your brain with labeling. So the neuroscientists have discovered that when we have an amygdala hijack, it's often because we're not sure or uncertain about something. But if we can label it and go, oh, I'm concerned about this, or I'm frustrated by that, or I'm angry about this, or I'm frightened of the other, then our brain can do something about it. It can begin to calm down and go, right, it's that thing. If it cannot label, it continues to search for something awful that it can relate to, which often puts you very rapidly back to when you were very young and perhaps not very resourceful. So then you begin to get child-like behavior, which is also not particularly good. People start to shout and scream and throw tantrums and that sort of stuff. And we've seen that. I think all of you have seen that with adults at some stage in your working lives. So what we need to do is we need to be able to name something and label it and then claim it and go, yeah, that's the thing that's bothering me, or that's the thing I need to think about, so I can move away from my threat response into my prefrontal cortex and begin to rationally think about it, understand it. Frame it by taking a couple of deep breaths and being able to go, okay, I can calm down now because I know what this thing is. And then reframe it and say, how do I need to position this in order to be able to utilize it effectively? So a challenge can become an opportunity, and threats can be something that become a challenge, and then a challenge can become an opportunity. So I want to also mention then some labeling that's been going on for the last 40 years, really, around Vuka and Bani. Now, some of you might be familiar with Vuka. Can anybody tell me any of the items from Vuka? We've talked a lot about in the last, especially since the pandemic, but really since 2001, when there was that disastrous attack on America. The US Army originally coined this phrase back in the 80s. Have we got anything in the chat?
Nothing.
I read about it last week, but I've forgotten.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's nice to be able to see then. Ali, do you want to say a few words about this?
Yeah, so as David said, this is a concept that really became popularized in the 80s, which is a while back now. And it was really about the military noticing when they actually got boots on the ground that things were not at all as they expected, and they really didn't know how to deal with it. And they categorized, that's typical, isn't it? My phone never rings, that'll go away. They categorized it as they could see how volatile the situation was, and that made things very, very difficult to manage. There was a great deal of uncertainty. It was very hard to predict what would happen. Everything was very complex, particularly if you're looking in situations like, for instance, the war in Afghanistan. There was an awful lot of complexity, different factions who were aligned with other factions, but not that one. So there were a lot of moving parts that they had to try and deal with. And a lot of ambiguity. There's a lack of information. It was difficult to communicate. So they couldn't be certain of anything. So I'm back to certain. There's a lot of overlap between these four things, but it creates this kind of worst possible situation where it's very, very difficult to predict and plan and develop strategies to know how to deal with this situation. And lots of businesses have been able to translate that sort of from the battlefield into the world of modern business. And I think, you then only have to look at some of the big things that have happened in the last 10 years to see that, things like a global pandemic, things like wars in various parts, popping, and it's like a tinderbox, and things are happening a lot. And what they said was that in order to counter these driving factors that made things so difficult, we needed to have real clarity of what it was that we're trying to achieve as a business, particularly. We needed to seek always to really develop our understanding of the complexities in order to give us as much certainty as possible. In order to unpick that complexity, we need to seek clarity, and clarity is a word that David and I use a lot, and it really is a powerful word. If we can move through the clouds and actually get some clarity of the situation, that's the first step towards having a way forwards. And then agility, to be able to respond quickly in the moment when something becomes clear. When it becomes apparent what is needed to be able to respond to that. So it's quite a powerful acronym to really be thinking about how to behave strategically in our business.
And because this is already in the 80s, and we thought, well, maybe you hadn't heard it before, but we've heard it a lot. We are also looking at something a little bit newer. And so James Cassio has come up in 2020 with a new model that he says is beyond the Vuka, because the world has become even more complex and even more, in many ways, overwhelming. And he's coined the phrase BANI, B-A-N-I, which means that it's actually very brittle. We're beginning to see that some businesses with very little happening in a particular part of the market, just a small change in the market, doesn't go out of business because they're not agile enough in order to be able to move forward. And we're even looking at sort of structures around us that can be very, very brittle. Things can break up easily. The next one is that there's an overwhelming amount of anxiety. If you look at the amount of mental illness that's now occurring everywhere, especially amongst teenagers, with huge amounts of mental stress, that we're having this underlying fear of this threat response that's actually damaging our thinking in the way that we talked about, because we're all having mild amygdala hijacks almost on a daily basis. So there's this anxiety permeating everything. He also said it's non-linear. So we can't really think that, like Ali was saying, a straightforward procedure or a straightforward, action in some way, that we need to be constantly expecting rapid change. AI, who here, for example, is already using or playing with some sort of large language model, ChatGPT or something like that? Okay, something. Shoma, you're just sort of waving a little bit, but yeah, maybe, maybe not. David, okay, good. Well, we invite you to start playing with it because this stuff is taking over a lot of what we're actually seeing in the world. And that can be very nonlinear. And then also this bit around incomprehensible. So Ali was talking earlier about the fog or the, being in the clouds, and we need to be able to find a way through that. Now, that means that Jamea has come up with some things, but we've added some things as well about what we believe will be the antidote to these things. So the first one is resilience, because if something breaks, you need to be able to get back together again and sort of get yourself up again, stand up and go forward. So we all need to develop our resilience, and that's mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. With anxiety, we need to be mindful of how we're feeling and have empathy, not only for ourselves, but for others as well. So when someone's stressed, to be able to go, okay, what can we do to calm that down? So we need to be calming effects, especially as leaders. Nonlinear, we need to be able to go, right, there is no straightforward A to B anymore. It's constantly adjusting. So if you think an aircraft taking off from London, flying to, I don't know, Jakarta or America, it's constantly making adjustments. It's not just going in one straight line. It looks like it, but it's constantly making adjustments because it understands the systems of the weather and altitude and all sorts of things that are going on with regards to flying an aircraft. And we need to be better at thinking systemically as well about what's going on in our businesses. And we're going to share some thoughts on that. And then, of course, what this is all about is that the incomprehensible is about paradoxical thinking, how we can look at things that may seem to be opposing one another or contradicting one another or in competing demands with one another. And we need to be able to think about both of them at the same time, which really hurts our brains. So let's talk a little bit about paradoxical thinking. In fact, Ali, let me take a couple of slides first. So can anybody tell me what this symbol is or represents? Put it in the chat. Yin yang. Yeah, absolutely. And it comes from Chinese mythology. So from the 14th century BC. So this is a pretty old model. And it's about understanding opposing forces. So that there's the dark and the light. There's also interesting, not only is there the dark and the light that are sort of swirling together and constantly battling with one another, but not one isn't dominating the other completely, because there's always that sort of equilibrium between the two. You've also got some of the white in the black and some of the black in the white. And I think that is when I first learned about this and I saw, oh, right, there's part of the other in it, makes it even more complex, more interesting. And then the ancient Greeks came up with a term for this kind of thing around the 6th century BC, where they had this term called that something is paradoxos, which means contrary to expectation. It's something that's like, wait a second, that's not what we expect. There's something coming out of the blue here, or something completely opposite here, part of what it is, but yet it's its opposite. So a lot of things have to do with balancing competing demands. And Ali, you've got a nice story here. You're muted, Ali.
So look, I love sharing this. It's such a beautiful Italian race car, and the joy of it is it lives here because that's me. And it's loads of fun. But it also helps us to illustrate a really the power of paradox or the concept of paradox. So when you drive a race car like this, you're looking for that big wing on the back. The bigger that is, the more vertical that is, the more it's working the wings to give you downforce, which helps you round the fast corners, right? So it helps you get around the corners without slipping sideways. So you need that downforce to go around the corners. But the more you have that wing vertical, the more it's creating drag, the more it's creating resistance, which means you lose speed on the straights. And if anyone who watches anything like Formula One, which this is not, it's Formula 3, but same principle. If you watch Formula One, you'll know that at some tracks, they'll have virtually no back wing on at all because it's all about speed, and that's what's going to get them there first. But it's also about having that balance. And some of the cars are better around the corners. Some of them have got more power down the straights. And it's all about both and. You can't have one. You can't have downforce and no speed. You can't have just speed and no downforce. It's about finding the optimum balance of the two. So it's a nice practical illustration of the way we think about paradox.
The way we think about paradox is looking at some of the classic. This has taken sort of 20 years to develop, right, Ali? We've been working on this for a long time together and looking at different elements of it. We actually, when we discovered paradox theory, discovered that actually there's a lot of challenge in any business between balancing strategic thinking and doing, right, the performance. And how many businesses focus on one or the other and therefore get the balance wrong. Also, balance between business and people. What are the business needs? What does the business need to be successful, to be profitable? And what are the people's needs that they are engaged and motivated? And again, with the neuroscience, it's interesting that there's a seesaw effect because part of our brain, it's a different part of our brain that's used when we're thinking about task focus and getting things done along the business side of things, than it is about relationships and empathy with others, which is a different part of the brain. And you cannot use both of them at the same time. So we have to be able to be very agile at not getting sucked into one way of thinking, but to be able to easily float between two different opposite competing demands. So as we love a 2x2, I said before, we're then able to say, okay, what's required with regards to strategy and business? What's in that quadrant? Well, it's the business strategy quadrant with purpose, vision, strategy, and culture. And we've got a way of measuring this really, really quickly if you're interested. And then you got the people strategy, because you can't really have a people strategy without your business strategy. That's around the organization, how people are structured, selecting the right people, developing them, and making sure they're engaged. And in order to do that effectively and get stuff done, you need good leadership, teams, passionate managers, and effective individuals. And then finally, back to performance on the business side, you need to be able to have good ways of measuring stuff, analyzing it, evaluating, and then being able to change as well. And we've been developing this, and now we're working with this with a lot of our clients. And we've got a very simple tool that you can use to diagnose where you are. It only takes 3 minutes. Happy to share that with you later. We've noticed now that this actually is the antidote to the Bani that we talked about earlier. Because if we address Bani, it's really being able to have resilience for being able to understand all these different elements and making sure that we get good leadership who can develop good strategy, as well as good managers who can build strong teams. Be able to have mindfulness and empathy. All of the literature is now showing how leaders need to have really strong mindfulness, awareness themselves, emotional intelligence, and empathy. And of course, systems thinking, because if you're not effectively measuring things, you might not have the right organizational structures. And if you don't have the right managers, you might not be able to implement your strategy. So it's all interlinked. And this is a really good way of thinking about systems thinking. And of course, our favorite, paradoxical thinking. So let's just dive into a couple of paradoxes that we think are interesting and we'd like to hear your opinion on. So one of them is the paradox of opportunity management. It goes a little bit back to what we were talking about originally with the exploit and explore. The tendency to analyze and take business or financial risks. So the paradox of opportunity management has two primary traits in it, behavioral traits. One is risking, the tendency to feel comfortable with business ventures that involve uncertainty, and analyze pitfalls, the tendency to scrutinize potential difficulties related to a plan or a strategy. And again, you can see if we're very high on risking, but low on analyzed pitfalls. I'd be interested. What behavior might we see? Drop something in the chat. What behavior might we see? Very high on risking, so we're up in this quadrant up here. Low on analyzed pitfalls, but high on risking. What might we see from a leader? Impulsive, right? Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if any of you have ever known some leaders that have gone, hey, let's do this. It's going to be great. So we get impulsive behavior. But if we're very high on analyzed pitfalls and low on risking, now again, we see this in some leadership teams, what might some of the results be of that sort of behavior?
So
No changes made. Yeah, absolutely. And no opportunities taken advantage of. Too cautious, what might go wrong? What could go wrong? Thinking of the downside without looking at, actually, there's an upside to this as well. And therefore, what we need to develop is what we call mindful courage, where we can actually see what needs to be done. We can take a calculated risk, but have the courage to take the risk, but doing it in a calculated way because we are actually looking at emerging issues. And then sometimes there are some people who we find in the research that we do with teams that actually have cautious inattention. So they're not really thinking about much, and they're not really thinking too much about either the risks or what's going on. And they tend to be a bit disengaged with strategic thinking. So here's an interesting example of a team. And this is a made-up team, but it's just an interesting example to show we're not sharing anyone's data here. It's from a demo system that we have. What do you think might be going on within this team? Just without, I think it's nicer to, if you unmute and have a little chat about this. We've got a few minutes to have a chat around this. I'd just like to hear what your thoughts are. What might be going on here?
Are you showing anything? Because all I can see is your face.
I can see the slides.
I can't.
I can see it too.
I can
Oh.
see the slide.
I cannot see the
I'm
slide.
sharing the screen, right, Ali?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can
It
see it.
may
yeah.
be because if you got one or more screens open, it might be behind me that there's a secondary screen.
If you try going to the very top right of your Zoom window, there's a view button. And
Yeah, I'm not going to allow you to share, John,
click
because
side by side gallery. Try that.
hi, Asif. Can you see it now?
No, not yet.
Oh dear. Oh, I'm not really sure what's going on.
Okay. So I think it's something with your own view, probably. So if you can just try clicking those different options on the view menu on the top right-hand corner.
Yeah, I'm doing it now.
Okay. So any thoughts? What might be going on within this team? So let's just say this is a strategic leadership team of a large organization.
Is there a
What sort
leader?
of conversations might be going on? Abika, did you say something?
Is there a leader in this team?
That's a very good question. Right.
Yeah.
Yes, there is a leader in this team.
But it's
What
not
else?
differentiated. We don't know where he is or she is.
Correct.
we
We don't
also-
know where he or she
we-
is. David, you were saying?
Yeah, we don't know what the other competencies, traits, behaviors are of the people that are in the impulsive area or in the cautious area. Do they have other traits that would lead them to dominance and leadership? And so it doesn't only depend on this particular slide, it depends on the disposition of each of them with other competencies.
Oh, yeah. Humans aren't just one thing, right? I totally get that. Ali.
Just for anyone who can't see the slide, I've just taken a screen clip and popped it in the chat in case that helps you to understand what we're talking about.
Thank
So
you.
a couple of things. Yes, it depends a lot on what their other tendencies are. But I think Ibika's question is a really good one. Where is the leader? So what would happen if this was the leader here up in this high impulsive? What might be the impact of that on the team?
Nervous, making people.
Nervous, right? Especially for these people down here, right? They'd be very nervous. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and you'd have a lot of
Yes.
volatility and uncertainty, right? Because you wouldn't know what this leader was going to be doing next, and they're probably changing their mind frequently.
let's do this. Oh no, let's do this. And I've seen it. I've had clients where the leader was in that quadrant, and I saw them make some pretty expensive mistakes, actually, that cost, hundreds of thousands.
So what did the
pounds.
group with mindful courage do? Because there's 5 of them, which is quite a weighty force in that team that have mindful
Well,
courage.
interesting you say that, but it's interesting that really the only person who's got the most balance is this person here, because we tend to not just be one little dot on this. We tend to have a range of behavior around it. So these people actually have a range of behavior which sits a little bit into the cautious. But it's a good point. If this was the leader, it would be a far more balanced team, because then the leader is able to understand they've got relatively high risking, so they understand these people, but they also have relatively high analyzed pitfalls, so they understand these people, and therefore can bring the voices together and manage the diversity of the team. And that's one of the things that's really important these days. For any of you who may have read Matthew Syed and his book Rebel Ideas, is that cognitive diversity in a team is now critical to success. It's not about being the smartest in the room anymore. It's about being who can work best with others and who can create psychological safety where everybody can have a say.
And this reminds me, actually, just off the cuff. Some of you may have come across a very old technique that we use in decision making, which is De Bono's 6 thinking hats. With the idea where you put a different hat on and you take a different perspective. And I think if you have an appreciation of this group's individual strengths and preferences, particularly if you were that leader towards the top right there in mindful courage, you would be able to seek and encourage the more impulsive person to bring that perspective. Well, what are the opportunities that are most attractive? What might we be able to do? What could we do if we knew it was going to be safe, and help them to expand our thinking, while at the same time then leaning in to the more cautious members of the group and saying, okay, well, what are the pitfalls that you're seeing with that? So to a certain extent, if you can take a balanced position as a leader, you can then really harness those different, perhaps more out of balance individual preferences. And as a team, we become much stronger, much more effective.
David, what's the color telling us on that chart?
Great. Thanks for that. Great question. I should have explained it at the beginning. So what we do is we've got different maps, heat maps, that show us what the ideal is for different roles. And this one is particularly for leadership. So what are the studies by Dr. Dan Harrison, one of the developers of this tool, is able to say that ideally, as a leader, you want to be somewhere in the green zone. And what's interesting about it is you don't have to be that high on risking. As long as you've got some, let's say, I think it's about 7 on this, on a 2 to 10 scale. You need to have ideally above 7 on your willingness to take risks and deal with that comfort of complexity of uncertainty, but you need to ideally have at least a 9 on analyze the pitfalls. And then the light green zone is, okay, that's okay, but it's still some beneficial to have some development. Once you're in the yellow zone, it's going like, if this is an important part of your job, you really need to be thinking about some development. And the red zone is like, okay, watch out, there's some real red flags here. We need to watch out with your thinking that could be so unbalanced that from a leadership perspective, you could end up making some very serious mistakes.
And importantly, if you look at the shape of the dark green zone at the top, where you get the 45-degree angle going up to the very top right, what that's suggesting is that if your tendency to be comfortable with risk is as high as a 9, then you better also be equally good or better at analyzing pitfalls, because otherwise the risks can be really damaging. So you can be almost too high, beware being too high on these things. And if you are very high, you really need to work on that balance. Now, of course, for a lot of people who are very entrepreneurial, they have very high comfort with risk, and they may find it very tedious to be looking at the analysis pitfalls. And for a leader alone, that's not necessarily a problem, provided they surround themselves with other people and they consult and lean on those other people. So often you get an entrepreneur, and forgive me, they may also have someone who's maybe an accountant. Accountants tend to be much higher on analyzes pitfalls, much more uncomfortable with the risk. And as long as you're surrounding yourself and you're engaging those other people and you're doing it with self-awareness and a good team, you can get the best of both worlds. David, we probably need to move on, sorry.
Okay, yeah. So, we can spend a day talking about these things. There's so much in it. So, there are 12 paradoxes in total. If you're interested, let us know. We'll show you some more. But we also wanted to share this, the paradox of vigilant resilience, the tendency to be optimistic while also being prudent regarding emerging issues. And that brings us to analyze pitfalls again. It's the only one trait that shows up on 2 paradoxes. But this time, we've got it contrasted with optimistic. And this time, I'm just going to go through it quite quickly. Optimistic, if we're very, very optimistic and low on analyzed pitfalls, we come classic thing, blindly optimistic, right? But if we're very high on analyzed pitfalls and low on optimistic, then we get skeptical. And if we're both, we get realistic optimism. And then if we're neither of them, we get careless pessimism. So again, another team, this time you can see here we've got, so again, quite a broad spread of people. Now we've got 3 people nice up in that realistic optimism, but then, 4 in the yellow and 5 or 6 even in the red zones. So what might be going on in this team? What do you see as potential risks here?
It feels like quite a good balance, doesn't it, on first viewing?
Okay, but yes, there are some people who are clustered up in that realistic optimism. But what about the people over in blindly optimistic and the couple in the skeptical? How would you need to manage
benefit
those?
to running a team that has some of those people in it?
Well, exactly, right? And the nice thing about that is that a good leader, the paradoxical thinking, will go, I'm not freaked out by those people. I'm okay with them being blindly optimistic. And I'm okay with these people over here being skeptical because it may be very appropriate for their role. Classic thing, salespeople versus accountancy people or high compliance people. And it's about harnessing that energy and nudging these people so that they have the support around them within the power of the team, that they don't go off and do something blindly optimistic and make mistakes. However, if it's a sales team, I would be checking their figures and their pipeline because they might be a bit more rosy than it actually is. Ali?
Yeah, and just to kind of bring this one to life, but I can't look at this paradox without thinking of Winnie the Pooh, for those of you who are familiar with that popular culture. But, you've got Tigger. He's the blindly optimistic, everything's always going to be great, bouncing, lots of energy. And then you've got Eeyore, the donkey, who's the skeptical one, who's lovable, but it's a real drag on the energy in the team. And so, managing these differing sorts of personalities in the team can also be a real challenge.
I was just going to make a funny comment. If it's funny, the people that are extreme, as in skeptical and blind optimistic, give them a little bit more stress because then they'll flip over.
Oh, well, now that's an interesting point because just a little bit of detail that John just mentioned there, in that when we get very stressed, especially when we're down here, we can actually have a stress response which held us over into this. But that's a level of detail that we leave for another session when we maybe do a deeper dive into some paradoxes.
Okay.
But the nice thing about it is that, what we find when we share this with teams is that there's no right or wrong in this. It's just, okay, this is where you're at the moment. These are your scores, their behaviors. What can you do to balance it? So we don't want the people to be less optimistic. These 3 people here are 4 because this is a double up. We don't want them to be less optimistic. We just want them to nudge into at least, ideally, the green zone to get to about 7.5 on analyzed pitfalls, so they can be better at understanding the need for scrutinizing potential difficulties and emerging issues.
David,
So, any other questions on anything we've covered so far?
David,
Yeah.
I had a management team, leadership team for a Fortune 500 grocery chain.
Right.
And that they had, of the 16 members of the leadership team, we had 9 blindly optimistic
Wow.
and
Wow.
1 skeptical.
Wow.
Right.
And the blindly optimistic were, of course, the marketing and development team.
Right.
And the skeptical was whom?
Finance?
The CFO.
CFO, yeah, finance, chief financial
And
officer. Yeah.
during
Yeah.
our discussions, he turned into Jack Nicklaus in The Few Good Men. You want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. So they were in conflict all the time, but he was also the balancer, so that that the organization didn't go off on extreme tangents. So it was,
And that's a nice point about balance, because that's what Steve was saying earlier around, okay, you need some balance, especially if you've got a lot of people in one particular place, that you need that balancing effect.
mhm.
But once again, what we say is that people up here can understand both. They can lean into the optimistic and they can lean into the analyze pitfall, because these people really only have one behavior that they can use. Let's just criticize everything and let's just analyze it all to bits. These people have one behavior they can use, which is, hey, it's all going to be great. Come on, because like we don't want it to be bad, so let's just make it great. Where these people have 3 behaviors. They've got optimistic, analyze pitfall, plus this realistic optimism. And that's really what we're promoting with paradoxical thinking, is to go, how can I move from either or into both and how can we help keep as few things as possible in our brain, but so that at times when we need to do paradoxical thinking, we can actually say, yeah, what is the optimistic bit about here? What are all the good things that could happen? And let's for a moment clear the decks and just also think of all the bad things that could happen and let them sit beside one another so we can do some decision making. That requires your prefrontal cortex, and unless you're calm enough, you'll be triggered off and on an emotional hijack, or yeah, becoming blindly optimistic and not seeing the truth. So I'm aware of time. Ali, you prompted me earlier, and I just want to wrap this up. So tips for leaders to adapt and succeed in a rapidly changing business context. We promised we'd give you some tips. The latest thinking really is all about comfort with paradoxes, being able to do that paradoxical thinking, being able to have systems thinking and recognizing that everything is so interrelated. But when we make a change in one part of our business, we need to be very, very aware of the potential unintended consequences in another part of the business and really do some analysis about that. Mindfulness and empathy is becoming a major part of what leadership is all about, to understand people, to understand ourselves, and to understand others, and also to think about why people are behaving the way they're behaving. Cognitive diversity, we've done many now workshops on this, really helping to promote diverse teams, because all of the evidence shows that it's not about having a bunch of smart people in a room, it's about having a bunch of people in the room who think differently and who can get on well together. And then finally, transparency and communication. So we'd really like you to be considering how you can enhance these ways of behaving and thinking in order to be able to address the complexities that we're all facing. So still have a bit of time for Q&A if you want to hang on for a bit longer. But for next steps, each of you is going to be given the opportunity to discover your clarity score. James, you've already done it. Yay. And we're discussing that. Also, you can book a free consultation if you want. We're very available to be able to have a chat about some of the issues that you might be facing with regards to leadership teams or the Clarity Matrix issues around business strategy and performance, people in business. And come to the next workshop, because we love having these workshops. It's great fun to be able to have a chance to speak with you, hear your thoughts on different things. And the next one, the last one this year actually, will be at 12:30 on Wednesday, the 20th of November. So put the date in the diary. We'll be communicating with everybody about that shortly. So on that note, I just like to say thanks. But really, we're both just hanging on for a bit longer. If you've got any questions or would like to ask any questions about anything that we've covered so far, including some of the things that I know some of you said, oh, I would like to know more about this aspect of leadership because I asked you. If they haven't been addressed yet, now's the time to ask.